They didn't yell it, that's what made it worse. It wasn't a fight or some dramatic scene, it was a whisper across the hallway, sharp enough to split something inside me. "She's not real family," one of them said. The words floated past me like smoke, heavy and slow, but unmistakable. I was carrying a tray of tea. I didn't drop it. I didn't say anything. I just stood there in the silence that followed, realizing how quickly years of presence can be dismissed by bloodlines and technicalities. I had been there. For holidays, for hospital runs, for the awkward teen years and the darkest nights. I had held them through panic attacks, stitched hems for weddings, covered shifts so they could sleep. I had stayed when others left, and still not real family. I smiled as I placed the tea down, careful not to spill, careful not to show the tremble in my hands. No one corrected her. No one disagreed. The comment slipped into the air like it belonged there, like it had just been waiting for someone to say it out loud. And suddenly, all the rooms I'd cleaned, the rides I'd offered, the bills I'd helped paid, they felt like invisible ink fading under too much light. I sat down in the corner and watched them talk, laugh, pass plates, while something in me quietly retracted. Not out of pain, at least. Not just that. It was something colder, a knowing, a line drawn without my permission. And from that moment on, I understood. If they saw me as not real family, then I had to stop acting like my place here was guaranteed. I stayed through dessert. That's the part no one ever talks about, the quiet endurance after the blow. I poured coffee, passed around plates, even complimented the pie. My face did all the right things. But inside, something had shifted. I wasn't angry yet, just stunned. I kept replaying the moment, wondering how long they'd felt that way. Had I always been the outsider and just never noticed? Or had I noticed and convinced myself I wasn't? The worst part was that the person who said it wasn't a stranger. She was someone I'd braided hair for, cooked soup when she was sick, held when her fiancé left her. I had loved her like a sister, and she had cut me out with 5 words. It made me question every memory, every favor, every late-night phone call. I started to see them all differently, like scenes from a film I hadn't realized I was only a supporting character in. I went home that night and sat in the dark for a while. No music. No TV. Just the sound of the heater clicking and my own breathing steadying itself. I wanted to cry, but the tears didn't come. Instead, a strange kind of calm did. Cold, precise, almost surgical. I wasn't going to argue with them. I wasn't going to plead for recognition. If they didn't see me as real, then maybe it was time I started treating them with the same kind of emotional distance. Not out of revenge, but out of necessity. Because love without respect isn't family, it's just labor. And I was done working unpaid. The next morning, the house was quiet, but my mind wasn't. I moved through my routine like muscle memory, boil the water, feed the cat, fold the blanket over the couch. But everything felt sharper. Every corner of the room seemed to echo what had been said. I stood in the kitchen and looked at the calendar hanging near the fridge. Birthdays, anniversaries, appointments I never missed. I had built my life around their needs, filled in every blank space they left, patched up every forgotten detail. I had answered calls at midnight, stayed behind when everyone else traveled, and kept the house running when no one noticed it was work. But apparently, none of it earned me a name on the list. Not in their eyes. Not when it counted. I opened the drawer where the documents were kept, the ones no one looked at until something went wrong. Insurance papers, medical directives, power of attorney forms, all signed, all structured, all with names. I searched for mine. I wasn't surprised when I didn't find it. And that, somehow, was worse than shock. It was confirmation. I hadn't just been overlooked, I had been written out long ago. Quietly, legally, efficiently. I closed the drawer, but not the question it left behind. If something happened tomorrow, who would they say I was? An old friend, a live-in helper, the name they stumbled over in discomfort. I stared at the blank corner of the calendar and made a decision. If I wasn't family in their story, then I would make sure I was family in the eyes of the law, because love can be erased. Paper cannot. The first call I made was to a lawyer I knew from years ago, someone I had once helped during a long recovery. We weren't close, but she remembered me. "Tell me what's going on," she said gently. I told her everything, not with anger, but with clarity. I explained how I had been living in that house, caring for people I loved, giving everything I had without a single signature to show for it. She didn't sound surprised. "You'd be amazed how many people think love protects them," she said. "But it's ink that does." That sentence stayed with me. I had never needed to prove my worth before, but now I understood it wasn't about proving it to them. It was about protecting myself from being erased again. We went over documents I hadn't thought much about before. Medical proxies, living wills, shared ownership, emergency access. Things people ignore until they need them, and by then, It's too late. I sat at the kitchen table later that night, flipping through papers with highlighters and notes, feeling like I was translating my life into a language no one could deny. Every clause, every line, was like stitching myself into a fabric. They had tried to cut me out of. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. Not yet. I wasn't looking for a fight. I was building a foundation, quietly, carefully, one signature at a time. Because if I had to be my own witness in this life, then I would make sure the evidence was irrefutable, not for approval. For protection, days passed, and I kept to myself. I still cooked meals, still watered the plants, still answered when they needed something, but I stopped offering. There's a difference. I started observing the patterns, how decisions were made, who got consulted, and who got informed. I noticed how my name was never brought up unless it involved doing something for someone else. They had built a rhythm where I existed only in service, rarely in recognition. And once I stopped volunteering, the silence around my presence became more obvious. No one asked if I was okay. No one noticed I had stopped sitting at the table. It was like my retreat validated their belief that I had never truly been one of them. But what they didn't see was that I was no longer shrinking. I was preparing. I spent evenings organizing everything: document scans, notarizing, copies stored safely in places they couldn't reach. I began drafting my own directives, updating my emergency contacts, changing the details on forms where I was previously listed as other or not listed at all. For the first time, I wasn't asking to be included. I was including myself in every line that mattered. I walked past them during those days, invisible only if I chose to be, and that choice became my quiet form of power. They thought silence meant submission, but mine was strategy. Because when someone tells you you're not real family, what they're also saying is, we don't expect you to stay. So I didn't. I stayed legally, permanently, and soon. They'd see the difference one afternoon while they were out. I sat at the dining table with a thick folder in front of me, everything I'd gathered over the past weeks. Legal confirmations, copies of notarized forms, proof that I wasn't just someone who helped out around the edges. I was now part of the core, whether they liked it or not. I looked at the chair where I usually sat, slightly pulled back from the table, always half in, half out. That was over. I slid the folder into the household cabinet right next to the insurance binder where everyone else's records were kept. I didn't hide it. I didn't announce it. I just placed it there with the quiet certainty of someone who no longer needed permission to exist. That evening, dinner was like usual, casual conversation. Dishes passed, small jokes exchanged. And yet, I heard her voice again in my head. She's not real family. I smiled quietly to myself and took another bite. Let them laugh. Let them forget. Because when the time came when someone needed a decision made, when a file needed to be pulled, when the question of who had a right to speak arose, my name would be there. Not written in pencil, not added as a footnote. Typed, signed, and sealed. I no longer needed to be loved, to be acknowledged. I had mistaken those two for too long. What I needed was standing, and I had earned it in silence, with documents instead of words. They still didn't see it, but they would. Not because I'd forced them to, but because systems don't lie like people do. A week later, something happened that none of us expected. One of the elders in the family had a medical emergency serious enough to send everyone into panic. Ambulances, quick decisions, the kind of chaos that strips people bare. I stayed. Not because I wasn't afraid, but because I had already done the work no one else had thought to do. While they argued over who would ride along, who had access, who could authorize treatment, I walked upstairs, opened the cabinet, and pulled out the folder. Inside was the medical directive signed weeks ago, naming me as secondary power of decision. Not out of manipulation, but because the person now unconscious had once whispered to me in the kitchen, "You're the only one who actually listens." I had brought the form to them gently, humbly, and they'd signed it, not realizing its weight. Now it was everything. At the hospital, while others fumbled with their last names and excuses, I handed the document to the nurse at intake. She read it, nodded, and turned to me. "You're authorized," she said. The words echoed in my chest, not like victory, but like truth. I walked into the room where the machines beeped steadily, and I sat beside the bed, knowing I was supposed to be there, not just emotionally, but officially. The others arrived later, confused, asking how I got in. I didn't answer right away. I just looked at them and said softly, "Sometimes being family isn't about what you say, it's about what you sign." And for the first time, they had nothing left to argue. They hovered outside the room, whispering to each other in that fractured tone people use when control slips from their hands. I could feel the shift, not just in the hospital's hallway, but in them. They were realizing I hadn't just been present all those years. I had been paying attention. While they were planning vacations and arguing over who brought what to family dinners, I had been learning how decisions were really made. Who got called, who got access, who got ignored. One of them, her voice sharp with disbelief, asked, "Why would she sign something like that with you?" I turned to her calm but clear, because I was the only one who stayed when no one else showed up. She opened her mouth to reply, but nothing came. The silence felt like something had been dropped between us, and neither of us wanted to pick it up. I turned back toward the room, gently adjusting the blanket on the chair I'd been sitting in. The nurse came in again, spoke only to me, asked about preferences, allergies, emergency contacts. I answered everything, not because I wanted to prove a point, but because I could. Legally, documented, irrevocable. It wasn't about winning. It was about not being left out of a story I helped carry. And now, in this fluorescent-lit corridor filled with the smell of antiseptic and unsaid truths, they all knew no matter what they thought. No matter what they whispered, my name was on every document that mattered. Not written in love, not granted by sentiment, but earned, signed, and filed permanently that night. After the doctor confirmed things were stable, everyone slowly filtered out. Some left without a word, others offered half-hearted smiles, unsure of how to face me now. I stayed behind, alone in the room. The steady beeping of the monitor filled the silence. I sat beside the bed, watching the rise and fall of the person I had cared for more deeply than I had ever admitted. Not out loud, not to them. Love doesn't always announce itself, it's in the details. The remembering, the quiet persistence of showing up. I didn't need them to understand that anymore. I had stopped needing their validation the day I realized how easy it was for them to define me out of convenience. But paperwork doesn't run on sentiment. It runs on presence, timing, consistency. And that's what I had always given. I took the medical file the nurse had left behind and placed it gently into the bag by my chair. One of the forms had my signature next to a note. Contact in case of change. Secondary but present. That word present, it clung to me. I was no longer background. I was documented, acknowledged, permanent. I leaned back in the chair and let my eyes close for a moment, not in exhaustion, but in something closer to peace. Because finally, everything I had given was no longer invisible. It was structured, traceable, real. And when they would later sit around their own tables, retelling the events of that week, they might skip my name again. But the files wouldn't, the hospital wouldn't, the law wouldn't, and neither would I. In the days that followed, the atmosphere around the house changed. Not overtly, there were still greetings, small talks, questions about groceries, but the undercurrent had shifted. They no longer looked through me. They looked at me, and not always kindly, some with guilt, others with quiet resentment, as if my presence now came with a weight they could no longer ignore. I wasn't the helper anymore. I wasn't the fill-in. I had become something more difficult to categorize, someone they couldn't erase, someone they now had to account for. One of them finally asked, "Why'd you go through all that trouble?" I smiled gently, because one day someone was going to make a decision. I should have been part Avon. I wasn't going to leave that up to a room of people who forgot I existed. She didn't respond, just stood there, swallowing whatever excuse she was about to make. I had spent years making things easier for everyone, smoothing over conflict, staying quiet in tension, folding myself into the corners of their lives. But now, I'd unfolded, signed lines, stamped truths, created a paper trail that even the coldest hearts couldn't sidestep. I wasn't angry, just done being polite about being invisible, so I kept showing up, but not the way I used to. I no longer rushed to clean their messes. I didn't offer help they wouldn't ask for. I became a presence that stood firm, not seeking entry, but confirming my place. And with every passing day, their discomfort wasn't my burden to fix. It was the mirror I no longer had to avoid. One morning, the eldest siblings, someone who had never said much to me beyond pleasantries, asked if we could talk. We sat in the garden, coffee in hand, the silence between us heavier than the steam rising from our mugs. "I didn't know you had all those papers," he said, eyes fixed on the grass. I nodded. "You weren't supposed to. Not until it mattered." He shifted uncomfortably, clearly grappling with something unspoken. "It's not that we don't appreciate what you've done," he started, but I raised a hand gently. "It's not about appreciation. It's about structure. About making sure I'm not treated like a guest in a house I've helped hold together." That stopped him. Maybe for the first time, he saw it for what it was, not an act of rebellion, but of "You caught us off guard," he admitted. I smiled, not bitterly, just honestly. "Good. Maybe now you'll think twice before deciding who counts." He looked away and I didn't press further. This wasn't about extracting guilt or forcing understanding. It was about making them sit in the awareness of what they'd never had to consider before. That family isn't just blood. It's presence, memory, endurance, and, sometimes, paperwork. When the conversation ended, he thanked me, not dramatically, just a quiet thank you for everything. And while the words didn't rewrite history, they landed softer than I expected. Still, I didn't let them pull me back into softness. Gratitude doesn't equal access. And a thank you without inclusion is still a locked door. Later that week, I received a call from the hospital. Nothing urgent, just a request to confirm follow-up care and whether I'd be the one bringing him to his next appointment. The question was posed so naturally as if it had always been my role, and maybe it had. But this time, the difference was in the tone: professional, formal, official. They addressed me by name, used the word representative, and asked for my signature electronically. I hung up the phone and sat for a moment, letting the quiet wash over me. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because I finally felt grounded. I wasn't floating at the edge of their lives anymore. I had stepped into something solid, legal, recognized. I walked into the living room and noticed a few of them gathered. Talking softly, they stopped when I entered. One looked at me with something like curiosity, maybe even respect. I didn't interrupt. I just picked up the mail, nodded, and walked out. Because I didn't need their approval anymore. I had built my place quietly, like a stone wall rising behind a garden. Not flashy, but unmovable. And now, when they told stories, made plans, or faced emergencies, they would have to say my name. Not because they wanted to, but because they were required to. I was no longer relying on memory or sentiment. I had built a paper trail that led directly to my seat at the table, and I would no longer accept silence as proof that I belonged. I had written myself into the story permanently, legibly, and without asking for permission. The following Sunday, we had another family lunch. The kind that used to leave me drained, smiling through being overlooked, clearing plates no one thanked me for, nodding while they shared memories that conveniently skipped my name. But this time, I came differently. I didn't cook, I didn't serve. I brought a dish, set it on the table like everyone else, and took my seat without waiting to be invited. Conversation buzzed around me, familiar and rehearsed, but I didn't cling to every word, hoping to hear my name. I had already heard it where it mattered: on documents, in directives, in signatures that wouldn't disappear with a change of mood. Midway through the meal, someone made a joke that once would have stung. Something like, "She's practically part of the family now." There was laughter, but I didn't flinch. I simply looked up and said, calm and clear, "No, I am part of the family. Check the paperwork." A few chuckled nervously. One or two fell quiet, but no one challenged it. They couldn't. And that silence, it wasn't uncomfortable for me anymore. It was confirmation. I didn't need them to rewrite their stories. I had already written mine. After dessert, I sat in the garden while they cleaned up. No one asked me to help hand. I didn't offer. Not out of spite, but because I was done auditioning for a role I already held. They could keep pretending I wasn't family, but they'd have to do it while spelling my name correctly on every form that mattered. Later that evening, I walked past the hallway cabinet and paused. The drawer was slightly open, just enough to see the edges of the folders inside. I knew my documents were still there, untouched but undeniable. It gave me a strange kind of comfort, not triumph, just certainty. For so long, I had begged quietly for recognition, thinking it had to come from their mouths to be real. But now I knew better. There are truths that live in silence, and there are roles we earn not through titles but through actions. And when those actions are dismissed, reduced to gestures, you do what I did. You put it in writing. I closed the drawer gently and walked back to my room, where I kept a copy of everything in my own files, labeled "dated safe." I wasn't preparing for war. I was preserving my place. Because families forget, rewrite, and distance themselves when it's convenient. But paperwork has a longer memory than people. I sat by the window with a cup of tea and watched the sky shift from soft gold to deep gray. I thought about everything. I'd carried the errands, the grief, the compromises, the waiting, and realized I no longer felt heavy. I felt anchored. I wasn't hoping to be chosen anymore. I had chosen myself, and that choice had weight, reach, consequence. One day, when another emergency comes or a decision must be made, they'll reach for the folder. They'll see my name, and maybe then they'll realize you can't cut someone out of the story once they've signed every page before bed. I stood in front of the mirror and looked at myself the way I used to look at them, searching for proof that I belonged. But tonight, I didn't search. I saw a woman who had stopped waiting for doors to open and instead found the key, who stopped asking to be included and started documenting her own presence. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't hurt. I was resolved. For years, I had told myself that being there was enough, that love would eventually translate into recognition. But families don't always translate love the same way. And sometimes, they only understand permanence when it's notarized. I turned off the light, knowing that, even if they never offered me a place at the emotional table, I had ensured my seat at the legal one, not with noise, not with demands, but with quiet, precise clarity. And that's the version of me they'll have to live with now, not the helper, not the background, but the name on the line. I laid down, letting the silence stretch out beside me, not empty, not lonely, but full of everything I no longer needed from them. Because when the time comes, and it always does, it won't be their opinions that matter. It will be the paper, the record, the truth I signed into existence while they weren't looking. Have you ever had to make your presence official, just so no one could pretend you were never there?